Okay, so we're just going to try and speed through as many of these in as much detail as possible so that because these cover almost like literally so many of the year 13 macro essay questions apart from financial markets and development. So let's go with question one first. I'll go through it my way, and then at the end you guys can ask questions and I'll test you as well. So fixed versus floating exchange rate. And the real question in the exam would either be something like a country has a fixed exchange rate or a country is thinking of adopting a fixed exchange rate. What are the pros and cons? Or is this a good thing for macroeconomic objectives or vice versa with floating? But while we're revising, we can just do the pros and cons of each. So if we have a fixed exchange rate, or if we join like a currency union, then we do not have any control of the currency. And wait, so if we do have a fixed exchange rate, we can buy and sell. So if we have a fixed exchange rate, we can buy and sell reserves of our currency or a different currency. So this is what China do. And this means that we can control our currency, our exchange rate at any time. So therefore, you know how we have four macroeconomic objectives? The objective of a current account balance payments would be relatively easy to achieve because whenever we're in a deficit, we could lower the currency. And whenever we're in a surplus, we could increase our currency, the value of it. And then we could easily switch from being in a current account deficit or a current account surplus. So for example, China always like to be in a surplus. That's their way of growing their economy. So whenever it's necessary, they would devalue their currency by selling a bunch of yen on the currency market. The downside of this is also what the advantage of a floating exchange rate is. So a floating exchange rate is when the value of the currency is determined by demand and supply only, nothing else. So it's basically a free market, which is kind of what I was drawing before. The disadvantage is what we spoke about here, which is that we don't have full flexibility of our exchange rate. The only thing we can do, which we can say we can still slightly control our currency through changing our interest rates. For example, if we lower interest rates, people may sell the pound to save in a better currency, a higher currency, which has higher interest rates. So supply would shift to the right, for example. And then we can still somewhat control our currency. So it's not completely out of control, but that's still difficult because when we change interest rates, then that affects our macroeconomic objectives in other ways. For example, inflation. So with this one, we don't have to. Basically, we can use monetary policy purely for inflation. So we don't have to use monetary policy at all, interest rates at all to change our currency. There won't be any conflicts. With this one, what was the other one? Okay, so I was basically just saying that lower interest rates, if you lower interest rates, that can both cause inflation and affect unemployment, but it can also cause exchange rates to fall. So this is confusing. So a fixed exchange rate saves us having to worry about inflation and exchange rates together. So we can have the currency reserves in order to control exchange rate, and we can have interest rates in order to control inflation. Both can be controlled separately. Um, on that note, countries with fixed exchange rates cannot really have monetary policy. So in the UK, for example, we can use interest rates for monetary policy. China cannot have monetary policy in a way that they change interest rates every month. Because imagine you have a team of people who are changing, controlling their currency to a high amount of detail. Um, and then you have another team of people changing their interest rates every month. Then they might do opposite things. So that wouldn't work because interest rates and exchange rates can both clash with each other. So the downside here is that you can't use interest rates like monetary policy, but the upside here is that we can. So um, so just to summarize, a country like China can easily control their balance of payments at all times because all they would have to do is buy or sell currency reserves. But they don't have monetary policy. Um, they don't have monetary policy, so they can't easily control inflation, unemployment, economic growth just by changing interest rates. Whereas in the UK, every single month, the Bank of England meet to control inflation by changing the bank rate. But if we were in a current account deficit, we can't control that very easily. The last thing is that you could argue that or evaluate that countries with a fixed exchange rate can still use fiscal policy. So you could basically argue that monetary policy isn't even that important because if you wanted to change inflation, you could just increase government spending or reduce taxation. But that has its downsides as well. Let's move on to the next one. What is the best policy to fix the current account deficit? This one's much easier. The first one was quite a detailed question, but it's still important to know. Um, so there are four policies, and in your exam, I would just pick two or three and do them in a lot of detail, but I'll teach four anyway. So one of them is lower the exchange rate of your currency. Um, Another one is protectionism. And I would specifically just do tariffs because it's easiest to remember the diagram and explain the diagram in a lot of detail. Um, and bear in mind, all of these have weaknesses, but that's the point of your essay that you're going to be evaluating them throughout. One more, which is probably my favorite one, is supply side policies. If anybody can't remember the year 13 stuff, we did supply side policies in year 12, and you could easily apply it to this question. And I'll show you how. And the last one was one that Ismail said, which was fiscal contractionary fiscal policy or just contractionary policy. So I'll go through them all. But this one has a lot of weaknesses. That's a good and bad thing. You can evaluate the weaknesses more, but it's probably not good to conclude with that one. So lower the exchange rate. We'll start with that because we've already been talking about exchange rates. So if we lower the currency, everything becomes relatively cheaper in the UK. Let's just pretend we're reducing the current account deficit of the UK. So therefore, the value of imports decreases. The amount of imports decreases, the amount of exports increases. And there we go. We fix the current account deficit. And we can also explain that AD rises and relate it to the other ones of the other three macroeconomic objectives, and explain that maybe that aggregate demand rises, so real GDP rises, and it's a good way to create economic growth as well. The evaluation for this is the Marshall-Lerner condition. The Marshall-Lerner condition basically just says that a currency depreciation only improves balance of payments if exports and imports are elastic, but not, or makes it worse if it's inelastic. The J curve also backs this up even more and says that a current account deficit gets worse before it gets better. So the easiest way to think about this is that one of the things we import is oil. So let's say we want to improve our current account deficit, so we lower the exchange rate. Now imports become more expensive. Does that mean we're able to just say, guys, let's stop importing oil? We can't do that because we rely on oil heavily for energy and fuel. And there's also so many other examples, so you could easily just research some. And we can't just suddenly say we're not going to import them. Therefore, if we were previously uh like importing 1 million units of oil for 10 million pounds, then all of a sudden we're still going to be importing the same amount, but this is just going to become like a bigger number, like 15 million pounds. Basically, we can't stop importing some things because they're inelastic. And most of the stuff we're importing could be deemed as a lot of the stuff we're importing could be deemed as inelastic, as necessities. And this has a lot of implications as well. For example, it increases cost of production. I'm going to get onto this with the next question about what's better, a strong or a weak currency. But this would increase cost of production and it would be quite bad because SRAS would go to the left and we'd have cost push inflation. Another example of a policy is protectionism. So I would draw the tariff diagram. Okay. So for this question, I would literally just I'd go straight to the point. I'd just say a tariff is protectionism is increasing barriers to free trade. And one example is a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports, and then just go straight into the diagram. So the diagram is basically a supply curve and a demand curve, just like normal. But then we have this world supply line, which is horizontal. So I would just say a tariff is a tax on imports. Then I would do the diagram. And I would just explain a bit about the diagram. I would just say world supply is perfectly, so if it's horizontal, it's perfectly elastic because there are millions of buyers and sellers in the whole world. We're not just doing it in the UK now. So relative to these ones, which are about the UK, world supply is about the whole world. So there's millions of buyers and sellers. So that's why it's elastic because there's so many close substitutes. The tariff shifts supply to the left. Left means up. Um, and explain very carefully that imports fall from here to here. The reason for this is if we ignore this tariff line first, okay, pretend it didn't exist, until Q1, what's cheaper? This line or this line? This one's cheaper. So Q1 is how much we buy from the UK. Everything else until here is how much we import. Now, if we look at the tariff line, what's cheaper? This or this? This one's cheaper. So we actually buy in the UK up to here. Everything else from here to here, wait, everything else from here to here, we import. So our imports have fallen from Q1, Q2 to just Q4, Q3. So I would write that. I would say that imports fall from Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4. And domestic sales or domestic production increases from 0 to Q1 to 0 to Q4. Okay. But this is the important part because remember the question was, how do we reduce a current account deficit? So we're saying that we're just focusing purely on reducing imports. So therefore, surely the balance of payments will improve. Now we can go to evaluation. And all we have to do is say that, very simply, that the protectionism leads to retaliation. So it means that if I stop importing, you might put the tariff back on me, or you might stop importing from me. So whilst my imports goes down, my exports would also go down. Okay. You can evaluate the goods as well. The good thing is that there is tax revenue, the rectangle, KNLM. And another good thing is that domestic sales goes up. This creates jobs, and maybe in that time it could lead to specialization. And also it could depend on the context. This could be about the UK or it could be about a developing country. So this might be more important if it was for a developing country. But the retaliation is a big evaluation, which makes it a risky policy. My favorite is the supply side policies. And I would basically just say that what supply side policies are, they are policies that increase competitiveness or productive potential or LRAS in an economy. Give an example of your choice. So reduce tax rates or increase spending on infrastructure. And this would lead to greater productivity, which would lead to greater quality and greater quantity and lower cost. And all of a sudden we become, the key word is more competitive. We have lower prices than other people, than other countries to produce the same thing. So if we're more competitive, we can produce the same quality as another country at a lower price or at a faster rate. And all of a sudden our exports become more attractive. So we say that our exports go up. And there would be no harm of retaliation. We can still import what we were importing. We're just going to export more. Because now we're better than other countries at producing these exports. So it's a very good way to prevent current account deficits in the long term or in the future. But then the downside is just that there is a huge, same way you would evaluate any supply side policy, even in the year 12 question, there are huge time lags and huge opportunity cost. So, for example, HS2, I believe it's costing over 100 billion pounds, and it's taking over 10, 15, 20 years to from start to finish. So, if you had a current account deficit, right now, it would be impossible to fix it through supply side policies. Even if you picked a different one like education and training, it would take people 2 or 3 years to get better education and training, and the effects would be very long term. This one is contractionary fiscal policy. It's basically the idea that you, like, let's say you increase tax rates or lower government spending, and then people, there's deflation in the economy or disinflation, lower confidence. Things kind of stabilize in the economy, so living standards get worse, so people don't get tempted to import. I guess this would be appropriate if a country's in a very big boom and there's high confidence. So we're just importing a lot of luxury goods. So if we calm everything down and lower inflation, then people will be less tempted to import. However, if you're randomly doing this, then it would cause a downturn and maybe a recession. And that has a lot of very dangerous downsides like deflation and unemployment. So it wouldn't be a good idea just to do this purely for the sake of uh, improving a current account deficit. So I would go with these three. Protectionism, because you don't have to get tired writing a massive paragraph because most of the work is done in the diagram. Um, Exchange rates, because I think it's easy to understand this topic, and the Marshall-Lerner conditions are really easy and um, a really difficult evaluation for everyone, but you guys know it really well. And then supply side policies. Again, a year 12 one, easy to remember and easy to explain how it would fix, how it would answer the question. Um,
Could you just go back down to the contractual one really quickly?
yeah.
Yes, I just need to make a note.
So yeah, just for the recording as well. One more point about this, lowering the exchange rate. It's not really that possible in the UK as well, because again, we don't have a fixed exchange rate. So it's not that easy, or it's almost impossible to just quickly lower the exchange rate. So that's another evaluation. But the question could be about different countries with maybe a fixed exchange rate, or maybe they don't care that much about monetary policy. So then that would be a fair point. Um, this one, it says the question comes up and it would say something like a country has a current account deficit. Is it how important is it to fix it? Or is this like really bad or is it not so bad? So let's go through this. So there are only two sides to this. So we literally just have to do 2 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs. Um, we don't have to stress because it's just a yes or no question. So the arguments for no are that um, a current account deficit could be a small percent of GDP. And also we know that AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And the UK always have a current account deficit, but it's always a relatively small percent of GDP. So if AD is all of this stuff and this stuff is very, very big and this stuff is a small percent, if this is negative, it won't make too much difference. One more point for no is that a current account deficit may be a sign that a country is already doing well. And we would talk about how when let's say a country is in a boom, then there might be um high levels of or really low levels of unemployment, high incomes, and all of a sudden people have demand for luxury goods. So they're more likely to buy a car at that stage, and the car might come from another country. So naturally, our value for imports would go up when a country is already doing well. And if this is the case, it would back up this point and say that C and I might be quite high, and therefore that would naturally cause some imports to increase. One more interesting point about no is that a current account deficit can automatically fix itself. Um, this is quite a weird one, so listen to the whole thing and then it will probably make sense. Especially if it's a random, if a country randomly gets a current account deficit randomly one year and it doesn't normally have one, then what would happen is imports would increase or imports would be high and exports would be low. If imports are high, then that means we are selling the pound a lot. And if exports are low, then that would mean there is low demand for the pound. So if you were to do an exchange rate diagram just of supply and demand, then we would see that basically, let's just pick one of these because again, it's confusing to do both. So let's just say the supply of the pound was to increase. In that process, look what happens. The price of the currency ends up naturally falling. So if if there's a balance of payments deficit, current account deficit, then the value of the pound falls. And we talked about this earlier. If the pound is low, then this would cause more exports and less imports. So therefore, we're naturally going to get out of a current account deficit because when we were in a current account deficit, prices of imports became too high. Um, this is especially the case with short-term or random or temporary current account deficits. So you would argue that it's nothing to worry about. But on the other hand, for some countries, a current account deficit might be quite bad. For example, even in the UK or the USA, they run a current account deficit every single year, which means that they are always importing more than they are exporting. And it signifies two things. It signifies over dependence on imports, which means that they are very vulnerable to economic shock. For example, if for USA, if China were to uh, increase their currency, because normal countries would just stop importing at that point, but because there's been an overdependence through many, many years of importing, they would have to keep on buying stuff. So, for example, the UK, we are dependent on oil and things like that. So, in recent years, or recently, import prices have gone up. So, we've had cost push inflation, and then this literally caused a recession in the UK this year because of SRAS falling to the left, and we couldn't do anything about it because we're over dependent on imports. And it shows one other thing, which is a weak supply side, which goes back to one of my earlier points about how, in the long term, supply side policies are basically one of the best ways to prevent being in a current account deficit. And this is a persistent current account deficit, by the way. Yeah. So if it's if it's a persistent current account deficit year after year, it means imports are more than exports every single year. And it's bad because it shows two things, overdependence, which means we're vulnerable to economic shocks, and a weak supply side, which is dangerous for the economy because it um just means there's overdependence on other economies. Okay. Um, let's do number 5 and then number 4. So at this point we've covered most of this question through the other ones, but let's start with the low currency, and then let's go on to high currency after. Wait. So the low currency is good because it means exports should be high. I use the word should on purpose, and imports should be low. So we should pick off. Remember, we're always in all of these questions, we're always talking about the 4 objectives. So therefore, we're ticking off one of the 4 objectives. And this also means AD should be high because we know that AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Then if AD is high, we have high or low unemployment and high economic growth. So we're literally ticking off so many of the 4 objectives, which means that surely a low currency is a really good thing. That's like the main point, and I would just go into a lot of detail in terms of year 12 stuff, like really explain why. So talk about how how labor is a derived demand, talk about how if aggregate demand is high both from the UK and both from other countries, like our exports, if that's high, then we need more people to work. And if we need more people to work, that creates jobs, that creates higher wages, higher incomes, higher living standards, higher economic growth. And you could do a whole paragraph or two just purely based on the year 12 knowledge you have. Um, the downside of this, and I would start that off in evaluation and mention the Marshall-Lerner condition again. And remember it said that a uh, devalue, a depreciation in currency only improves balance of payments if imports and exports are inelastic. And we can talk about how strong our supply side is and how over dependent we are on other countries. The benefit of a really high currency is that we so most businesses would import raw materials from another country. So we'd have really, really low costs of production. If we have really low cost of production, then that would allow SRAS and maybe even LRAS to shift to the right. As long as you explain, I would just go down SRAS because you could explain that exchange rates being high mean that import prices are very low, so there's low cost of production. And if SRAS shifts to the right, it means we don't risk high inflation. So we're having SRAS shifting to the right, and we have AD. So we're going down on the price level and up on real GDP. And we can talk about how that creates jobs, real GDP increases, incomes increase, living standards increase, and literally just link it to year 12 again in as much detail as you can. So the first argument in favor of free trade is that free trade always leads to free trade means we are making use of or going along with comparative advantage. And the thing about comparative advantage is that every single country should have a comparative advantage. Because comparative advantage is when you have a lower opportunity cost of production. So it doesn't mean that you're better at producing a good. So if we take this example, who's better at producing cars, A or B? B is better. Who's better at producing trucks, A or B? B is better. So B has an absolute advantage in cars, and B has an absolute advantage in trucks. However, um, B is just like 5 better at cars, but B is 15 better. Technically, it's like multiplying, but if you're not very good with maths, if some of you don't do maths, then you can just picture it that B is a bit better at cars, but a lot, triple better than A at trucks. So country B has a comparative advantage in trucks. It should focus on trucks, which is way better at, and it can specialize in trucks. Then you specialize in what you are least bad at. So not what you're best at, but you're least bad at. And if everyone does that, then everybody can specialize. And from year 12, we know the benefits of specialization, learning by doing, greater total output. And again, if we were to do the maths, there's a theory which says that um, you don't need to learn the way they do it, the calculations, but there is a way to prove that this theory always leads to greater total output. So that's it. That's nice and simple. On the other hand, protectionism. Protectionism is um so for the protectionism argument, I would literally do the same thing I used in one of the previous essays, and I would start by an example, which is tariffs, and I would do the tariffs diagram. And rather than explaining protectionism in my own words, I would just explain it via the diagram. So it's a really powerful diagram to learn because it takes up a lot of your thinking because you're able to just describe it with the aid of the diagram, which is what it's there for. It's there to help you rather than something you have to remember. By doing this, you can explain that imports go down from Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4, and domestic sales goes up. And again, if it's in the context of a developing country, you could use different points such as protecting or allowing infant industries to grow. And if it's in the UK, you could talk about how it allows us to become less reliant on imports and in the long term can allow us to it can create jobs and it can allow us to export more in the long run because we're standing on our own feet a bit more and becoming better at certain things, which we can't take the easy option of importing. On the other hand, there's a big risk of retaliation. And it means that if we stop importing some things from another country, they would stop importing some things from us. And that doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit us or the other country. And therefore, this theory is probably a better conclusion. But there's no right or wrong answer for the conclusion. It just depends on the context and your explanation. Basically, a downside about free trade. One downside about free trade is just that free trade leads to free trade and a free exchange rate has one risk, and that is if you don't have a strong supply side and you're engaging. So if you don't have a strong supply side and you're engaging in free trade, then there's still all of that risk that we spoke about in some of the other essays, which is a risk of a current account deficit. It could even be a persistent one. And it also means you're vulnerable. It's actually more of an evaluation almost to this one. Like it's a really good evaluation to the comparative advantage theory. So let's say that um I import cars, I export trucks. Let's say everything's going good. I'm exporting trucks and I'm doing really well, but the country who I'm importing cars from um ends up in a civil war or like natural disasters or has some politics going on, then all of a sudden I'm going to be impacted with the cars I'm importing. So I'm way more vulnerable to supply side shocks when I'm engaging in free trade. So free trade is very risky that way. And another example would be that if I'm always exporting trucks, but for some reason I have a weak supply side, maybe there's so in a developing country maybe, or even in the UK, if there's like a brain drain or if people aren't keeping their skills up or people are preferring to work in other industries, then all of a sudden the people making trucks would lead to lower quality or lower output of trucks. So I might lose my comparative advantage. I can't just rely on the same comparative advantage for forever. Um, so yeah, that could easily affect balance of payments. And depending on how important balance of payments is to your macro objectives, then that would be a point to make. But it could just be an evaluation of this point.